If you open a map of Africa and look at the southern tip of the continent, one country clearly dominates the region. That country is South Africa. It's the economic powerhouse of the continent. It produces gold, diamonds, platinum. Its ports connect two of the world's great oceans, the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean, giving it strategic access to global trade routes. And sitting near the center of the country is one of Africa's largest and richest cities, Johannesburg, a massive industrial hub built on some of the richest gold deposits ever discovered. But there's one massive problem. South Africa is running out of water. Unlike the tropical regions further north, much of South Africa sits on dry highlands and semi-arid plains. Rainfall is unpredictable, rivers are limited, and climate change is making droughts longer and harsher. In fact, South Africa is already considered one of the 30 most water-stressed countries on Earth. And nowhere is that problem more dangerous than Johannesburg. Because despite being the economic heart of the country, Johannesburg sits in one of the worst possible places for water access. No major rivers, no large natural lakes, and millions of people who depend on water every single day. So how does the city survive? The answer lies just across the border, in a tiny country most people barely notice on the map. A country completely surrounded by South Africa. A small mountain kingdom called Lesotho. And without it, the economic engine of South Africa might quite literally run dry. So to understand why this tiny nation is so important, we first need to understand the geography that made Johannesburg possible in the first place. At first glance, South Africa looks like a geographic giant. It covers more than 1.2 million square kilometers, making it the 25th largest country on Earth. Its coastline stretches for over 2,800 kilometers, touching two massive oceans, the cold Atlantic Ocean to the west and the warm Indian Ocean to the east. That's a rare geographic privilege. And when you travel across the country, the landscape feels almost confusingly diverse. In the east, the province of KwaZulu-Natal is lush, humid, and subtropical. To the north lies the edge of the Kalahari Desert, a vast, semi-arid wilderness. Near Cape Town, the climate is Mediterranean, famous for vineyards and coastal winds. Meanwhile, much of the interior is dominated by the harsh scrublands of the Great Karoo. It's a country overflowing with minerals. Gold, diamonds, platinum, and one of the most biodiverse regions on the planet. But there's one critical resource South Africa lacks: water. To understand why, you have to look toward the center of the country where a massive geological wall divides the continent. This is the Great Escarpment, a huge natural barrier that separates South Africa's narrow coastal regions from its vast inland plateau. And in its most dramatic section rise the Drakensberg Mountains. Towering cliffs, deep valleys, sheer basalt walls. And right in the middle of this mountain fortress sits a country that almost looks like a hole punched into South Africa's map. That country is Lesotho. Lesotho is one of the strangest geographic anomalies on Earth. It's one of only 3 enclave countries in the world, nations completely surrounded by another country. But unlike San Marino or Vatican City, which are basically city-states, Lesotho is enormous by comparison, roughly the size of Belgium or the US state of Maryland. But the real oddity isn't its borders. It's its altitude. Lesotho is the only country on Earth whose entire territory sits above 1,000 meters in elevation. Its lowest point is higher than the lowest point of any other country on the planet, which is why it's often called the kingdom in the sky. While South Africa is defined by wide plateaus and open plains, Lesotho is defined by verticality, sharp ridges, basalt peaks, deep carved valleys, a landscape shaped by ancient volcanic activity and millions of years of erosion. And this difference in elevation isn't just an interesting geographic detail. It controls the entire region's climate. Moist air from the Indian Ocean travels inland across South Africa's plains. But when that air hits the towering wall of the Drakensberg and Melody Mountains, it is forced upward. As it rises, it cools. And when it cools, it releases enormous amounts of rain and even snow. This creates one of the most dramatic climate contrasts in Africa. On the South African side of the mountains, the interior becomes increasingly dry. In fact, South Africa ranks among the most water-stressed countries in the world, with highly unpredictable rainfall. But cross into Lesotho's high mountains, and you enter something completely different: a water tower. Despite covering only a tiny fraction of southern Africa's land area, Lesotho receives a disproportionate share of the region's precipitation. Winters are cold. Snow frequently covers the peaks. And in fact, Lesotho even hosts the only natural ski slopes in all of sub-Saharan Africa. But here's the key detail. Water flows downhill, and Lesotho sits on the roof of southern Africa. All that rain and snow eventually drains out of the mountains, carving rivers that feed one of the most important waterways on the continent, the Orange River. The river begins high in the mountains of Lesotho. From there, it crosses into South Africa and flows west across nearly the entire country. It cuts through the dry Karoo, supports farms and cities in otherwise hostile landscapes, and eventually empties into the Atlantic Ocean near the border with Namibia. In other words, the water that keeps much of South Africa alive doesn't actually come from South Africa. It comes from Lesotho, which creates a fascinating and slightly uncomfortable geographic relationship. On one side, you have South Africa, huge, rich in minerals, connected to global trade, but slowly drying out. And on the other side, you have Lesotho, small, mountainous, economically isolated, but sitting directly on top of the region's most reliable freshwater supply. And relationships like that rarely stay simple, because once water becomes this important, politics always follows. But to understand how Lesotho managed to stay independent rather than being absorbed into South Africa long ago, we have to go back to the 1800s, to a time when these mountains were the only thing standing between the Basotho people and total destruction. Today, the borders of South Africa look fixed and permanent on the map. Clean lines, recognized borders, two separate countries. But those lines were not drawn peacefully. They were drawn through war, survival, and one of the most remarkable diplomatic decisions in African history. Because to understand why Lesotho exists as an independent country inside South Africa, we have to go back to a time when the entire region was collapsing into chaos. For thousands of years, Southern Africa was inhabited by hunter-gatherer peoples like the San people and the Khoikhoi, who roamed the plains and deserts. But around 1,500 years ago, a huge migration began. Bantu-speaking farmers started moving south from Central Africa, bringing with them iron tools, agriculture, and cattle herding. Over centuries, these migrations formed many of the major cultures of Southern Africa, including the Xhosa, the Zulu, and the Sotho. For a long time, these societies lived in a fragile balance. But in the early 1800s, everything changed. A brilliant and ruthless military leader rose to power along the East Coast. His name was Shaka Zulu. Shaka completely transformed warfare in Southern Africa. He reorganized the Zulu army, introduced new battle tactics, and built one of the most powerful kingdoms the region had ever seen. His expansion triggered a chain reaction of violence across Southern Africa known as the Mafekane. Entire tribes were displaced. Refugees fled across the countryside. Those refugees clashed with other groups, forcing them to flee as well. The interior of Southern Africa turned into a domino chain of conflict. But in the middle of this chaos, one leader saw an opportunity to survive. His name was Moshoeshoe I. Moshoeshoe was a relatively minor chief of the Basotho people, but he understood something crucial. Fighting the Zulu on the open plains would be suicide. So instead, he chose a different strategy. Geography. Moshoeshoe gathered his people, along with refugees from shattered tribes across the region, and led them into the natural fortress of the Melody Mountains. There, he built a stronghold on a flat-topped mountain called Thaba Bosiu, which literally means mountain of the night. According to legend, the mountain would mysteriously grow taller during the night, protecting the people sleeping on top. Of course, the mountain didn't actually grow, but the fortress was nearly impossible to attack. From this rocky stronghold, Moshusho managed to defend his people from both Zulu forces and rival tribes. Over time, the refugees he gathered became something new, a unified nation, the Basotho people. But just as the Zulu wars were fading, a new threat appeared, and this one was even more dangerous. From the south came the Boers' descendants of Dutch settlers who had lived in the Cape Colony. Many of them were migrating inland to escape British rule. This movement is known as the Great Trek, and the Boers were looking for one thing: land. They found it in the fertile Caledon River Valley, the agricultural heart of Moshusho's kingdom. There was just one problem. The Boers had horses and rifles. The Basotho had spears and shields. Seeing this technological gap, Moshusho quickly adapted. He acquired guns and horses for his warriors and began fighting using similar tactics. But the Boer pressure never stopped. Year after year, they pushed deeper into Basotho territory. By the 1860s, the Boer Republic of the Orange Free State was close to destroying Moshusho's kingdom entirely. Moshusho realized the truth. He could not win this war forever, so he made a desperate decision. He reached out to the most powerful empire on earth, the British Empire. Moshusho sent a message directly to Queen Victoria asking for British protection. It was a gamble, but it worked. In 1868, Britain declared the territory Basutoland, a British protectorate. The Boers were furious, but they could not challenge the British Empire. So the border was frozen where the conflict line stood. The Boers kept the fertile farmland they had conquered. The Basotho kept the mountains. And that moment is why Lesotho exists today. It wasn't created by colonial planning. It survived because it was a mountain fortress that asked for protection. Decades later, in 1910, Britain merged several colonies and Boer republics into a single new state, the Union of South Africa. At the time, many assumed that Basutoland, along with Eswatini and Botswana, would eventually be absorbed into South Africa. But the Basotho people refused. They remembered the Boer land seizures. They remembered the wars. So they lobbied Britain intensely to never transfer their territory to South African control. Then history took a darker turn. In 1948, South Africa introduced the system of apartheid, a brutal system of racial segregation and discrimination. At that point, Britain could no longer justify handing African protectorates over to an apartheid state. And so what had been temporary suddenly became permanent. Finally, in 1966, Basutoland gained full independence from Britain. It renamed itself the Kingdom of Lesotho. So today, we have two countries. One is South Africa, a massive industrial powerhouse. The other is Lesotho, a small mountainous kingdom born from resistance. But history has a strange sense of irony. Moshusho saved his people by retreating into the mountains. He secured their political independence. But in doing so, the Basotho lost their most fertile farmland to South Africa. What remained was a country of rocky slopes, thin air, and harsh winters. They had their own flag. They had their own king. But they had almost no economy. Almost. Because hidden in those mountains was something far more valuable than farmland. Water. To understand just how fragile modern South Africa really is, you have to look at its beating heart, Johannesburg. Johannesburg is a geographic anomaly. In fact, it's the largest major city on Earth that is not built next to a coastline, a navigable river, or a major lake. It sits in the middle of the South African plateau, more than 1,700 meters above sea level, far away from any natural water source that could sustain a city of millions. And it gets even stranger. Johannesburg actually sits on a continental watershed. When it rains in the city, the water literally runs away from it. Some flows north and eventually reaches the Indian Ocean. The rest flows south and eventually ends up in the Atlantic Ocean. So why would anyone build Africa's largest industrial city in a place where water doesn't stay? One word: gold. In 1886, the discovery of gold in the Witwatersrand triggered one of the largest gold rushes in history. Almost overnight, a mining camp appeared on the dry Highveld. and no one cared about water. Because at the time, the only thing that mattered was digging gold out of the ground. But mining camps turned into towns. Towns turned into skyscrapers. And soon, Johannesburg became the center of Gauteng, the industrial region that today produces roughly a third of South Africa's GDP. There was just one problem. The entire economic heart of the country had been built in a place with almost no reliable water supply. At first, engineers dammed nearby streams. Then they tapped into the Vaal River. But by the mid-20th century, it became clear that this wouldn't be enough. South Africa's population was growing, its industry was expanding, and Johannesburg was getting thirstier every year. So planners looked at the map, and they saw only one place left that had water: the mountains of Lesotho. This realization led to one of the most ambitious engineering projects ever built in Africa, the Lesotho Highlands Water Project. And this is not just a pipeline. It's a gigantic system of dams, tunnels, and reservoirs designed to literally redirect the natural flow of water across a national border. Here's how it works. Massive dams such as the Katse Dam capture rain and snowmelt high in the mountains of Lesotho. Normally that water would flow south into the Orange River and eventually into the Atlantic Ocean. But instead, the project sends it north. Because Lesotho sits so high above South Africa, gravity does most of the work. Water rushes through more than 80 kilometers of tunnels, drilled through solid mountain rock, crosses under the border, and empties into the Ash River. From there, it flows into the Vaal Dam, and that reservoir supplies Johannesburg and Pretoria. Without the system, the entire economic core of South Africa would struggle to survive. The scale is enormous. Phase 1 of the project already sends about 780 million cubic meters of water every year into South Africa. Phase 2, currently under construction, will increase that to over 1.2 billion cubic meters annually. Put simply, much of the water that powers South Africa's biggest economy doesn't come from South Africa. The mines run on Lesotho water. The power plants are cooled by Lesotho water. Even the drinking water in Johannesburg often begins its journey hundreds of kilometers away in the mountains of another country. In other words, South Africa has outsourced part of its survival. But this relationship also comes with risks, because South Africa is getting drier. Government projections suggest that by 2030, the country could face a water deficit of roughly 17%. We already saw a preview of this danger in Cape Town Day Zero water crisis, when the city nearly ran out of water completely. But if something similar happened in Johannesburg, it wouldn't just be a local disaster. It would shake the entire African economy. And this creates a strange balance of power. South Africa is larger, richer, and militarily stronger. But Lesotho controls the water flowing from the mountains. If those dams ever stopped working, whether from political conflict, infrastructure failure, or climate change, the consequences would be enormous. This means the two countries are locked into an unavoidable partnership. South Africa cannot afford instability in Maseru, the capital of Lesotho. And it certainly cannot afford to become an enemy of the country that controls its water supply. Which brings us back to the original question. Why can't South Africa survive without Lesotho? Because history and geography played a strange trick on the region. The British Empire and the Boer republics drew borders that separated the gold from the water. The wealth ended up in the dry plains. The water stayed in the mountains. And today, those lines on the map are sovereign borders, which means that as the planet warms and fresh water becomes more valuable than ever, the mountains of Lesotho are becoming more powerful. South Africa may have the bigger population, the bigger economy, and the stronger military, but no matter how powerful it becomes, it will always have to look up toward those mountains and ask a simple question. Will the water keep flowing? Because in the end, this isn't just a story about politics or economics or even engineering. It's a story about geography. A mountain kingdom holding the water and a continental power that depends on it. And maybe that's the most fascinating part of all. Because when you zoom out far enough, you start to realize something uncomfortable. Countries may draw borders. Empires may rise and fall. But geography quietly decides who depends on whom. And in southern Africa, it decided that the giant would depend on the mountain. If you enjoyed this deep dive into how geography shapes power in the real world, make sure to subscribe. And if you want to explore another place where geography completely rewrote the rules, I'll see you in the next one.